Good morning. Welcome to Cake People Development's webinar on safeguarding. So I'm hoping that you can all hear me nice and clearly. Feel free to pop a thumbs up or raise your hand if you can. Great, thanks Sam. Welcome to the webinar. So just going to run through a few bits of housekeeping. Just to get us going. So we're going to use the chat so you can talk to us, talk to each other. Excellent. Thanks, Bob, for letting us know you can hear over there at the airport. That's great. I've got everyone on mute. Obviously, there is your chat box there. We've got Colin who's helping assist me. So he's going to keep an eye probably a little more closely than I am on the chat window. If you've got any questions, please pop them all in. Hi, Joanna. I will come to questions and answers, generally speaking, at the end. So Colin will make a note of anything that you want to discuss, and we'll try and get to that at the end. If we don't get enough time, then obviously I will make sure that I answer those in a written format and provide those answers to the questions later on. As we go through, there's going to be a few polls. That's just purely little questions to find out where your areas of knowledge are around the certain subjects, just so that I'm not kind of trying to go over things that you already know, but also in enough depth if you're not sure either. Just to note, the webinar is being recorded. You will be shared on Cake Connect. It's also going to go into your Apprentice programme. So for you and for any learners that join us in the future, they'll be able to refer back to this as a resource. So now that we've done the housekeeping, let's take a look at what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be looking at safeguarding and we're going to look at it from how we think about it in our own organisations. I think it's just safe to say here is if you do spend any time reflecting on the webinar and thinking about how you can use it, what you might have learned from it afterwards, how you might use anything within your roles and within your organisations, then obviously please do use that as a reflective comment and log on your Apprentice, because that will count towards some of your apprenticeship no matter what programme that you're on. I think when we talk about safeguarding, it's often one of those areas that's really well considered, it's really well thought about in organisations where you classically deal with people who are in the vulnerable or at risk category. So we're talking schools, care homes, that sort of thing. But I think sometimes we do forget that people in general can become vulnerable at any point, and you don't have to fit into any category for that to happen. We're going to talk today about why it's important to have good safeguarding practices in your workplace, which then ensures the safety of your staff, your colleagues, and your customers. We're going to look at some issues that have been in the media recently around upskirting, county lines, and mental health. We're going to talk about what you should do if you have a safeguarding concern, and then we'll come along to the questions and answers. So just a little bit about me and why I'm here to talk to you about safeguarding. So obviously I'm Laura. I think most of you have probably spoken to me, seen me on various occasions. I've worked for Cake for about 2 years. Previously, before that, I worked in social housing, and that was sort of my main career basis up until then. I've been trained in safeguarding for about 12 years, probably a little bit more. And the last 6 years, I've been trained and working as a designated safeguarding lead officer in both the social housing setting and here at Cake. I started off working with elderly people, so people in that classically at-risk category. I then moved into a role supporting hard-to-reach families and domestic abuse survivors. My focus for me personally and here is to raise awareness of safeguarding for those who aren't seen as vulnerable or at risk, but due to circumstances beyond their own control, that they then dip into those categories. And I think it's when we start to consider what can make us vulnerable that we start to see why safeguarding actually is everybody's responsibility. Now, core topics, and when we talk about core topics, we talk about safeguarding, health and safety, prevent strategy, British values, equality and diversity and inclusion, mental well-being and wellness, mindfulness, personal development. All of those topics are what we call the core topics, and they are brought into apprenticeships for 2 reasons. One is they give a really good basis, no matter what level or what type of apprenticeship you're on, for knowledge and understanding and awareness of those key areas that affect us day to day in our jobs and our lives. And also because actually we live in a society where if you're in certain industries and organizations, you'll have higher focuses on perhaps one or two of those areas. So like we said, care homes will have a really high focus on safeguarding naturally. Factory settings tend to have a really high focus on health and safety. But what we tend to find is that we don't have a generalized approach to all of those topics. And so unless you're working in an industry where one of those areas is key, then what we find is that we don't necessarily know much about the others. So using the apprenticeship platform to embed these into your role is absolutely brilliant. And it's something that everyone here at Cake is really behind. Moving forwards, we're going to be doing these monthly webinars, which will always be recorded. So if you can't join us, which, it's great if you can, but if you can't join us at the time, then they will always be available on your Apprentice platform as well. So just want to get you all kind of sort of in the zone a little bit. And I just want you to start having a think about things that you think and reasons that could lead somebody to become vulnerable or at risk of harm for somebody who isn't in that classically vulnerable or at risk of harm group. So if you can just use the chat window to just throw some ideas out there about things that you think could affect that. We'll just have a few minutes looking at that. Financial difficulty, yeah, absolutely. Isolated working, definitely. Relationship breakdown, 100%. Yeah, all of those things, and they can lead to mental ill health. They can lead to feelings of depression, and obviously, isolated working can lead to all of that sometimes too. But obviously, there's a secondary health and safety risk around lone working long hours. Absolutely, and that can affect your health and safety. That can affect your mental health, everything. Socioeconomic determinants of health. Interesting. I like that, Kelly. Kelly, can you give us a little bit more detail on that if you can? That'd be great. Loss of a loved one, absolutely. And a lot of these things are things that can just happen. So they can, like, working long hours can build up slowly. So you wouldn't even necessarily suddenly find yourself in that situation or it affecting you in any way. But things like your finances, loss of a loved one, those sort of things can, they happen within a blink of an eye and you're not necessarily expecting them. Mental abuse and relationships, absolutely, absolutely. And domestic abuse is a huge, huge issue. Increasing carer responsibilities outside of work, absolutely. Again, things you're not necessarily planning for. Again, things that can happen really quite quickly out of nowhere and having to adjust to that. Absolutely, yeah. Yep, got you. Yeah, poverty, worklessness, absolutely. New parents, yes. Absolutely. Medical conditions, yeah. Again, poor management, absolutely. Yep, fertility issues, all of these things. So you can see just from those few minutes that there are so many situations which can make somebody or yourselves vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, you are at risk of harm. And, there's loads, like we've talked about, domestic abuse, mental ill health, drug and alcohol misuse, all of the things that you're noticing, absolutely. Yeah, challenges for children in school, absolutely, can affect the whole family and beyond. Peer pressure, absolutely. So, just thinking from my personal experience, I've got a little story I want to share with you. I'm sure some of you have probably heard it before, but I feel that it does highlight the issue quite well. And it's when I was working back in housing. Our customer services team were in a team meeting, and a tenant came in to report a broken tap. Very normal, everyday happenings. I went out to see the lady I was covering for them just while they're in their meeting and took down the details of the repair. I asked her, to be fair, several times if she was okay. She seemed absolutely fine. We were sort of having quite a nice conversation. Then came to looking at times and days that would be better for her so that we could book appointments for the workmen to attend. At that point, she became quite agitated. She explained to me that her husband would have to be there because the maintenance team were likely to be male. She started picking at her fingers, biting her lip, looking at the floor, a complete change in behaviour to what I'd been experiencing up until that point. Now, that instantly caused a concern for me. And so with some gentle questioning, building up some of that rapport and trust. And she then at that point disclosed to me 26 years of serious sexual and physical abuse from her husband. She'd never told anybody else about it. She worked full time. She went to her doctor's appointments and hospital appointments. Nobody had suspected anything. There weren't any other agencies involved. There was no other causes of vulnerability for her at all. Due to obviously the training I had at that point, I was able to reassure her. I was able to help her with some various options that we had available. And it was about 6 hours later, she was on her way to a women's refuge in a completely different county in the back of a police car. And I was then in the office putting together an injunction that would stop her husband from being able to come to the property or to contact and approach her. Something that really sticks close with me is just as she got into the back of the police car and she just looked at me and said, "This is the only time I have felt safe in 26 years. For me, it was having the right person at the right time in the right place kind of moment, but it absolutely highlighted that why safeguarding training and policy and process should be in all organisations. You literally never know when you might get the chance to save someone from harm. I think on the flip side of that, many years previous, when I was a young teenager, my father worked in a factory. It was quite a stressful environment, to say the least. There was very little management support back then. And a colleague of my dad's, who he'd worked with for years, worked with him every day, never suggested any form of vulnerability, went to the toilets during the shift, and some time had passed. They were getting a bit concerned. So another colleague went to check on him and they found him hanging. Obviously, that man killed himself at work in the toilets because he really simply couldn't carry on. Literally everyone who worked at that organisation was affected by it. I think most of their families were. That happened, when I was a young teenager many years ago, and it still affects me now. It still gives me goosebumps talking about it. I think every person who was around him at the time, his friends, his family and his colleagues, probably all had two questions, one being why and the other was, could I have stopped it? The reality is that there's no guarantee that anyone would have been able to stop it. And there's no doubt in my mind, though, that the working environment and the organisation that they were in wasn't inclusive. It didn't have safeguarding policies and procedures. There was a culture of just not talking about problems and issues. It was quite a laddish environment. Managers managed the processes, but they didn't lead their teams. And I think if it was different, then there's every chance someone trained might have spotted some signs and symptoms, or he may have even just been able to approach a colleague or a manager to say that he was struggling and get some support that he needed. So I guess this is why safeguarding is so important to me, and I do get very, very passionate about it. If you get it right, you can save lives. When you get it wrong, lives get lost, and it can be that strong. So we're going to move on. So you now know why I'm here and why I'm overly probably passionate about safeguarding. And we're going to just start looking at the first of our topics. So the first one we're going to look at is upskirting. So I'm just going to run a little poll just to see sort of where your level of knowledge is around that. That would be great. So you'll just see a poll coming up in a moment. If you could just click on the answer that best describes you, just so we can have a little look. That'd be great. Excellent. Okay, so that's great. So I can see that quite a lot of you sort of know about it, sort of maybe some a little unsure of what it really means. So we're not going to be going into a huge amount of depth with this topic. It's really just to highlight it. Just share the results with you for a moment. Right, so we're just going to pop back to our presentation. So just to kind of clarify, really, obviously upskirting is a very highly intrusive practice. Typically involves somebody taking a picture under another person's clothing without their consent and with the intention of viewing their genitals or buttocks with or without clothing. I think it's just important really to just think about the fact that it can take place in a range of areas. So it can happen at parks, schools, pubs, bars. And interestingly, British Transport Police have seen a huge rise in reports of it happening on public transport. Obviously, anyone of any gender can be a victim, and it is completely unacceptable behaviour. It's distressing, it's humiliating, it's a violation of privacy for victims. Why it's become sort of more in the media and more focused recently is that some stats have come out. So back in 2018, the reports were revealing about all of these areas where it was happening. And that although the majority of cases were female victims with male perpetrators, actually, that was just the majority. It wasn't always the way, but actually the ages of them were between 7 and 70. So it really did cover a huge spectrum of society. So we had the introduction of the Voyeurism Offences Act, which was commonly known as the Upskirting Bill. It was introduced on the 21st of June 2018, and it came into force on the 12th of April this year, 2019. It was actually followed from an 18-month campaign which was spearheaded by 27-year-old Gina Martin, and Gina was the lady in the picture that we had on the slide previously. Gina was actually the victim of upskirting herself in 2017, when two men took a picture up of her skirt at a festival in 2017. What we've got the new law, and the new law is to try and capture the instances where the purpose of the behaviour is to obtain sexual gratification or to cause humiliation, distress and alarm. And obviously, due to having the new law, perpetrators will now face up to 2 years in prison, and it's hoped that by criminalising the distressing practice, it deters people from carrying it out. Upskirting, when it's committed to obtain sexual gratification, can result in the most serious offenders now being placed on the sex offenders register as well. Obviously, prior to the law coming in, certain circumstances were being prosecuted under the common law offence of outraging public decency. But what Gina found, and then some more research that went into it, was that actually that existing criminal law wasn't able to capture all the instances that were being reported. So that was why this specific bill and act came into place. Obviously, if you're the victim of any upskirting, you should contact the police because it is a criminal offence. And they are there to support you. And part of this sort of process and the act was to ensure automatic protection as a victim. So, for example, you'd have protection from being identified in the media. So it's just to sort of highlight that, just go over it, give any background, and just to bring it back to the forefront now that we've got this act in place. So moving away from upskirting, another recent safeguarding issue that's been coming about and growing in intensity is something called county lines. So I've got another little poll for you. Again, it's just to see where your level of knowledge is around county lines. That would be fabulous. Excellent. Okay, so I can see we've got a whole range here, right from never heard it through to know quite a lot about it. So that's brilliant. Right. Okay, I'll just share those results with you now. Lovely. Right, so we're going to have a little bit more depth on this one. Again, it's more just to highlight and give you a bit of an awareness around it. So county lines, basically, in essence, it's a term that's used to describe the criminal networks that come from the large urban areas, so your big cities, who travel then to the smaller locations like rural and coastal towns on the basis to sell Class A drugs. Gangs typically recruit and exploit children and vulnerable adults, and they do that for various roles within the drug supply chain. And they often recruit people from the areas that they're wishing to sell to, so that when those people go into the areas to sell the drugs, they're not standing out and they've got the right accents and they make up a typical person from that county, which takes away sort of the highlighting to authorities. There's around 2,000 known lines. Now that's an increase, a significant increase from 181 that were identified in 2015. So in 4 years, that number has grown, and it is still increasing as we speak. So a few stats around county lines that we know about is 118 of those lines have known links to firearms. That one individual line can make in excess of £800,000 per year. That 69% of the drugs supplied through county lines are heroin and crack cocaine. That we know that the criminal networks themselves are using social media. They do that for several reasons: for recruitment, promoting their brand, intimidating rival lines, and also obviously avoiding identification and disruption from the authorities. Various analysis has identified that potential victims are around the ages of 11 to 56. Apologies, my slide says 15, it should say 11. High vulnerability causes for children, and obviously for any of you that are parents or aunties and uncles and things, this is good for you to know for outside as well. Include poverty, family breakdown, social care intervention, behavioural developmental disorders, and exclusion from mainstream schooling. High vulnerability areas for adults tends to centre around drug addiction and mental health. So what's being done to combat it? Well, obviously this is kind of a new issue really for our police forces and for our authorities. In September 2018, so just last year, the National County Lines Coordination Centre began to operate. Their objectives are to significantly increase the law enforcement's ability basically to get more accurate intelligence, so that they can map out the problem and find an effective battle plan for them to be able to fight against it. There's been an increase in areas around the UK that have carried out multi-agency prevent and protect work. And the Home Office has been engaged in talks with groups like Uber and the Licensed Private Hire Car Association. You know, these are people who they use various methods to stay undetected. So for Uber drivers, for example, it's knowing about what to look out for, looking at the signs, warning signs, and then what to do if they've got a concern. The Home Office also funded a year-long pilot project, which was run jointly with the St Giles Trust and Missing People. And they offered support and interventions to young people and their families who had been affected by county lines. And I think it's interesting that during just 1 week of coordinated law enforcement, which was carried out across the UK, there was over 600 arrests, and there was a further 400 vulnerable adults and 600 children that were offered safeguarding advice and support. So, I mean, that just shows the level of this problem. It's a really fast growing concern, and we all need to be aware of it and of some of the potential signs that someone has been groomed into the activity. Things like behavioural changes, so suddenly taking calls in private where they used to be quite open about that, perhaps a change towards always being on the phone if they never really bothered before, taking a lot of sick days or just going missing. They can all be signs. Now, I know that these things are always a bit vague because they can be signs for lots of other things, but it's really about just keeping your eyes and your ears open and being aware of it, and just thinking, actually, this is a really different behaviour for somebody else, for somebody that you've got to know. Obviously, if you become aware that someone is involved in the activity, then you need to call the police, and that's your duty to do. If you're not sure, but then you've got a concern and you think there might be a possibility, then you need to report it through your safeguarding procedures, and we'll look at that later on in this webinar. So it's just a bit of the awareness around county lines and what's going on around that. And we will update you again with some more information as it comes out. But obviously, because it's such a fast growing topic, and because we're still, as the authorities are still looking at ways to even form a battle plan on it, at the moment, it's just trying to understand the signs and trying to stop vulnerable people becoming groomed into these roles, into this drug supply chain. So we're going to move on to our next topic. This one we're going to look at in probably a little bit more depth, and we're going to look at it at very much the perspective of your teams, being a manager, being supportive to your organisation. It is a huge topic, and we'll cover it again from different perspectives during other webinars, but it's just looking at some practical steps that you'll be able to take to just be able to support people with some mental ill health. So just kind of starting with what mental health is. I mean, mental health includes our emotional, our psychological, our social well-being. It affects how we think, how we feel, how we act. It determines how we handle stress. It tells us how we make our choices and how we relate to others. Mental ill health can range from feeling a bit down to common disorders such as depression and anxiety, and then right through the spectrum to more severe and less common conditions such as things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. I think it's safe to say most people's mental health doesn't just be continuously good at all times. Usually it rises and it falls depending on our own pressures and our own experiences in our lives. So therefore, a person who might feel good mental health generally, but then experience some stress or anxiety just from time to time. And it's important to understand and address mental well-being and mental ill health in the workplace, because people generally who feel good about themselves generally will, we can say they'll work more productively, they interact well with their colleagues and customers, and they make a valuable contribution to the workplace. There was a recent Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development study, and it highlighted the impact that mental health can have on organisations. That study found that 37% of sufferers are more likely to get into conflict with their colleagues, that 57% find it harder to juggle multiple tasks, that 80% find it difficult to concentrate, that 62% take longer to complete tasks, and that 50% find they're less patient with customers or clients. Interestingly, the study also found that for the very first time, stress is now the leading major cause of long-term absence in both manual and non-manual workers. So that's a change from what we've been seeing in previous studies. The promotion of positive mental health in your workplace can be hugely beneficial. We know this. Staff with good mental health, they're more likely to be performing well, you're going to have good attendance levels, you're going to have good staff retainment. There's lots of approaches, methods, tools, resources online to help support organisations in promoting positive mental health in the workplace. And I'd urge you to go and see what's out there and consider if there's some that you could perhaps use in your own organisations. So we're just going to go back to our chat window now. And I'd just like you to tell us what your organisations are doing well around mental wellbeing and health, or any ideas that you have that you might want to share with each other about what you could be doing. That would be great. Open communication and peer support, absolutely. Definitely. Just being able to talk and feel that you'll be listened to and that you don't have to pretend to be someone else or pretend that everything's okay. Support from your peers so that you've got someone to speak to. So Scarlett, my manager, checks in with me regularly to see how, oh, where's that gone? Bear with me. I was reading that. We're all getting in on this now. Where your stress levels are at. Brilliant. So you're having those conversations. That's great. Right. Mental first health ages, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good. Oh, you've got a session happening right now. Excellent. Yeah, that's really becoming a great thing now. Wellbeing workshops. Oh, excellent. Great. Free service. Lovely. So yeah, absolutely. This is brilliant. So it looks like you guys, there's a lot going on for your organisations. Free counselling available. Thriving workspaces. Wellbeing sessions, brilliant. So there is loads of stuff that's already going on that's great, and it just shows. So Sean just launched mental health awareness training to all your managers and employees, brilliant. Put up posters, photos, workshop materials across the walkway for visitors and employees to see. You've helped people as a direct result of the posters, brilliant. Oh, this is absolutely, I love this. I love where we get to share all these ideas. This is great. So yeah, it's a really big topic, and I think people are really understanding the benefits of well-being and promoting good mental health within their businesses. And I think it is, yes, from a business point of view, it's increasing productivity and, bringing down sickness and absence figures and all of that stuff. But actually, it's just about having people that want to come to work and they want to be in your organization and that they're happy, because actually we spend quite a lot of our time in the workplace and it's nice to go and be happy about it, and know that actually if we need to talk to somebody, there's somebody there to listen to us. I know, some training which we've run, and you've mentioned it here, and it's becoming increasingly popular, is the mental health first aid, training staff to be mental health first aiders and champions, and just giving that better awareness, making sure that there's people who know what to do when somebody speaks to them, ensuring, especially in bigger organisations, that your staff know who they can speak to and have somebody that they can go and talk to, and approach. And I think the mental, all of that side of things, just bringing in the awareness. And you're right, putting up the posters so that it's on everybody's mind, is a really great idea too. And as a manager or as a team leader, you're going to play a crucial role for your organisation, and you need to feel confident in supporting your team members who obviously might suffer with mental ill health. You need to be able to spot the signs and know how to approach somebody who's suffering, and obviously know how to have those sensitive, supportive and professional discussions and conversations. Managers who are confident in understanding mental ill health and approaching staff who are suffering are then obviously going to be able to have those really good conversations, which ultimately then lead organisations to be having stronger performance and less staff turnover. And knowing that those people that you're having those conversations with, you're putting in some safeguarding for them, you're making them safe. I guess as a manager, you need to be approachable and available. Not always easy to be available all the time, but it's just making sure your people know that you are. And obviously just encouraging your staff to talk to you if they're having problems. I think it's an excellent manager is able to tailor their management style to suit the needs of each staff member, so that you become on the right level to them. Honestly, other things, monitoring your staff workloads, making sure you're setting realistic targets and goals and being really clear about the priorities. And it's that really important that as a manager, you're having regular one-to-ones and catch-ups just to check how work's going, how your staff are feeling. And obviously, just like if you can identify any upcoming challenges, both in and out of work, look at what support could be put in place and do that before it's needed. Then you're kind of just playing ahead of the game, which is really going to benefit everybody. And I think it's just the earlier you as a manager become aware that a team member is experiencing any mental ill health, the sooner steps can be taken, obviously, to prevent it becoming more serious, sooner support can be put in place. And once you start having those conversations and you start dealing with those situations, the rest of the staff see that and they understand it, and then it just spreads the culture throughout the business. I think also for me, it's just really important here that some of these, some of the signs of people suffering mental ill health and what to look out for. But actually, it's that they don't mean somebody is suffering, and we shouldn't make assumptions. But I guess if the signs are identified, then this is just a great time to have a private, sensitive and supportive conversation with your team member. Obviously, just check in and see how they are. Signs such as changes in their usual behaviour, their mood, or how they're interacting with their colleagues or customers. Changes, obviously, in their standard of work or focus on tasks. Appearing tired, anxious or withdrawn and reduced interest in tasks that they previously really enjoyed. Changes in appetite and or increase in maybe smoking or drinking. Increase in sickness and turning up late for work. Obviously, not everyone who experiences mental health exhibits these signs, or has any issues at work. For some people, work helps their mental ill health issue rather than the mental ill health affecting their work. So I think it's really important that as a manager, we don't get hung up on a person's diagnosis. If you've got a team member who's got depression, perhaps takes medication or has counselling, but performs really well, has no negative impact on the team or performance, you don't need to suddenly try and kind of initiate some changes or put in some extra support. It's just that it's crucial to make sure that you're asking your team members that simple question: how are you? How are you doing? create that environment where staff feel able to be open and honest about how they're feeling. I think it's also just being prepared that a team member could come to you and talk to you about their mental ill health. And that can be really difficult for you as well as them. And I think it's just vital, just stay calm, stay patient, being supportive, offering reassurance. Just a couple of little tips, maybe things to consider if a team member did approach you is, if you haven't already, move that conversation to a private space where you won't be disturbed. Thank them for coming to talk to them. Let them know that actually you really appreciate the fact that they're sharing that with you. Give them as much time as they need. People are your most important asset. Without them, there is no organisation or business. So, if they need the time, they need it. Try and focus on what's actually being said. And I think it's really important just to remind ourselves to be open-minded, because their issue might not seem big to you, but obviously it is to them, and that really is all that matters. It doesn't matter if to you that's not important, or it's not something to cause distress or stress or mental ill health over. Actually, if they feel like that, then it is absolutely important to them. And I think sometimes we quite often judge people by our own thinking and standards without meaning to, and that kind of keys into that unconscious bias that we have. Trying to identify what the cause is. So it might be looking at, is it a work issue? Is it a specific task issue? Is it an issue outside of work? Just once you've got the reasons behind it, if you can, it's not always going to be obvious, because that person might not actually understand what the cause is at that time either. Obviously, looking at potential solutions and support options, and it might be a referral to other agencies. It might be like a lot of you have said, you've got options around counselling, wellbeing services, all of that within your organisations. Be prepared for the unexpected. You never know what's going to be said. Obviously, don't be afraid to adjourn the meeting if you think it's necessary to think over what's been discussed before you make any decisions about how best to solve it, what support methods to put in place. It's always good to try and give them ownership. So let them come up with their own solutions, so that they feel more empowered to make those changes or to get that support. And just don't quiz them and make them feel like they're being interrogated. It's much more of a listening game than it is a questioning one. Obviously, some staff that are experiencing mental ill health are going to have to take some time away from work, no matter how early on that you approach the situation. And I just think, it's making sure that your staff member feels supported even when they're not at work, and that's just going to help them feel more settled about returning back when the time is right for them. So just in that area is, when you've got somebody who's going to take some time off, agree when and how regular contact will be maintained. And it is vital that contact's maintained, because a lack of contact is going to lead to misunderstandings, going to make them feel really undervalued, and they feel that they won't be missed. And so it's going to make it really hard for them to return. Obviously, if it's more appropriate for somebody else to be the person that maintains the contact, then that's absolutely fine. It's just ensuring that is in place. Just be positive, professional and supportive at all times. It's really good to agree with that person what they want their work colleagues to know about their absence and how they're doing. Quite often, people want the reasons for their absence to be shared with their team, so that they don't feel like they have to have that conversation with everyone and people just know. But you must find out from them and be led by them as to what they want people to know and understand. And just not pressuring them to return to work before they're ready. Always encourage a phased return. It doesn't have to be. It's just making sure that they've got that option. And obviously using occupational health wherever practical to look at ways that your organisation can support them and support their return to work. So I think the simple reality is mental health is behind almost all suicides. In 2017, there were 5,821 suicides that were registered in the UK, and that men are 3 times more likely to take their own life than women. The highest suicide rate last year was for men aged 45 to 49. There is some slightly good news, if you can call it that. The male suicide rate is actually at its lowest that it has been for 30 years, but it's obviously still way too high. Being more aware and having regular training around spotting the signs of mental ill health and knowing where to look for support really can only ever help this figure to keep falling. So it really is back to that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. So we've covered some topics around safeguarding, but I think knowing what to do with a concern or a disclosure or an issue is actually just as important as knowing what you're looking for. There's no point recognizing a concern if you then don't really know what to do with it. So I've got another poll, and I just want to kind of understand about what your knowledge and level is around raising safeguarding concerns. So if you can hit your buttons, that would be great. Absolutely, Sam. I've just seen your comment about important to offer some shared experience where appropriate helps to normalise the feelings. Absolutely. Even as a manager, you're human too. I mean, I think by sharing any experiences that you've got, it kind of makes people go, oh, do you know what? It's not just me. Because I think there isn't many people who can honestly say that they've never dealt with some depression or some stress or some anxiety issues at some point. Okay, so we've got a little range coming through again. So quite a lot of you, brilliant. Organisation has good policy process in place, so you know how to raise a concern and you know what's going to happen to it afterwards. Few of you not sure, but you know you'd speak to a HR or another manager. So that's great. Okay, so most of you have either got really, really good organisational policy and process, or if you haven't, you kind of know that you would go somewhere with it rather than just ignoring it, and just sort of saying to somebody, oh, I'm here if you want to chat. I would ask you all to double check if you don't know, if you have got an in-house safeguarding policy, and obviously make yourself completely familiar with it. If you don't, we'll be adding our safeguarding policy to your Apprentice platform, so you can take a look at that. As a learner with Cake People Development, you've got access to me as the safeguarding lead, so you can always call me to discuss your concerns and ask for support and guidance. You will also have in your local area a Safeguarding Adults Board and a Safeguarding Children's Partnership. Simply Google those terms along with your county and you'll find out the details of how to contact them. Obviously, I can also help in finding the details out for your local support agencies, groups, boards, partnerships, if you do struggle to locate any. So just want to take you back really to those earlier examples that I gave. The lady obviously who disclosed decades of domestic abuse, and the husband and father of 2 young children who took his own life at work. Without knowing what to do and initiating safeguarding procedures, that lady would have gone back to her home to the hands of her abusive husband. And yet, had there been safeguarding procedures and training and an understanding of mental ill health, there's a huge and undeniable possibility that the man that would have been alive, and he would have got support and the help that he really so clearly needed. Like we said, safeguarding is a core topic. It's brought into all apprenticeships, not simply because it's something to add to it, but because it's very clearly and simply saves lives. Obviously, if you feel you and or your organisation could benefit from any further safeguarding training that's aimed at your workplace, please don't hesitate to contact me to see how I can help. We're going to move on to some questions and answers. So I'm just going to hand over to you guys. So if you've got any questions for me, then please do pop them into the chat window. I'll just check with Colin to see if any have come through thus far. Not so far. So I shall give you a few minutes for questions. None from you, Sam. Is it a requirement for this company to have a safeguarding policy in place? If you are not working with people generally at risk, say for like children or care homes, then it isn't a legal requirement, but it's absolutely the best practice. So most people have switched to having one. It's also, as I said, for me, it's easy to go down the route of the legalities of saying an at-risk group, or people who are vulnerable and classically vulnerable. But I think, I hope today has highlighted that actually anyone can become vulnerable and at risk of harm at any point. So for me, I'd probably just ask the question, why wouldn't you have safeguarding policy in place to an organisation? I think it's really is best practice and going to help. It can only help and support your team, really. It's okay, Scarlett. If you haven't got one, perhaps go find out, just double check. And if you haven't, then, I'm happy to support you with looking at what we have and some guidance around creating a policy. That's not a problem. And, speak to your policy people, and that you can always put them in touch with me too. So from Grant, what would you say is the simplest thing we can all do daily to help safeguarding, and in particular the mental health of people we work with? Oh, that's a good question. I think that it is just having just making sure that you have an understanding or an awareness of the fact that we're human and anyone can be vulnerable for any reason, and that actually it's just always thinking about how can I make someone safe? What can I do to make that person safe? So that if somebody says to you, I'm having a really rubbish time of things, I'm really struggling, I'm not keeping up, instead of, even if that's a peer or a friend or anybody, that what you're doing with that is not just supporting and not just saying, yeah, that's actually really horrible, and I really understand, and I'm here if you want to talk, but actually then going away and looking at support agencies and referrals and raising those concerns, if it's in the workplace, raising those concerns with the relevant people according to your policy, and just identifying that we're all human, and we all have times when we become vulnerable. Absolutely, yeah, and no blame culture, and absolutely, and just that, it's that recognition sometimes that people need to talk, and we're not in society anymore where you go into work and you have to put on your work front and you shouldn't talk about how you're feeling or what's going on in your life. That actually we live in a much more inclusive society now. So yeah, it's around culture and changing that culture, and that comes from the top down. So it's trying to get our exec teams and our senior teams on board with it and understanding it and being visible and approachable. We'll just give a couple more minutes for some questions. I can see a couple of you are still typing. So yeah, let's have a look. So in terms of mental health, the issue often lies with self, putting too much pressure on yourself, not admitting you're struggling, and then blaming yourself. Absolutely, Scarlett. And I think we can all identify with times when we've done that. I certainly can. And I think that's when, as a manager, you can start to identify those signs and those symptoms in your team that they might be doing that. And then instead of just kind of going, oh, that's what Scarlett does, or that's what Laura does, or they'll be okay, is actually then, that's the point you step in and you go, do you know what, actually let's go have a conversation, let's go for a walk, let's go for a coffee, come in my office, whatever's appropriate. And it's that, how are you doing, what's going on for you, what's the challenge? Yeah, realistic goals and targets, and ownership over those, I think, as well, is getting your team to set their own goals and their targets, or being a part of that targets and goal setting if they can be, because it's very easy to go, well, oh, we know that, yeah, you could easily hit that goal, so we'll pop that in your objectives for this year. And actually that team member is sitting there going, oh my God, I'm not sure what you mean, or it's not specific enough, or actually you think I can do it, but I don't have the confidence to do that, and maybe afraid to then say that. So that can cause pressure there. But maybe sort of saying to someone, what would you see your goals as being? What would you like to set your targets at? And there might be a bit of back and forth and some conversations, so maybe pushing them a little bit further, maybe doing a bit of a stretch and challenge, but I think it is trying to be able to give people a bit of ownership over their own objectives can really help at work too. Okay, so I think we're probably coming to the end. Obviously, if you do have any other questions that spring to mind, then do pop me an email. All my details are up there on the screen for you at the moment. Massive thank you for attending the webinar. If you're watching it later as a recording, thank you to you too. As I said, any questions, just contact me at any point. Oh, thank you, Scarlett. That's very kind. Also, just a reminder to do a reflection on anything that you've learned today and how you might use it in your workplace. Thoughts about sort of whether as a manager, team leader, supervisor, somebody working in L&D in your organisation, how that can impact on what you're doing or what you might like to do with it. Anything around what you'd like to look into in more detail. Upload that to your Apprentix, calculate the time spent today attending the webinar and the time you spent on your reflection, and we'll get that mapped into your apprenticeship too, so that you can see some progress there as well. So thank you to all of you again for attending. The recording will be up later on today, as I said, in your Apprentix space. And do let me know if there are any topics that you want to see covered over the next few months and ongoing around any of those core topic areas, things that are of a real interest to you, because it would be really great to hear from you too. Thanks everyone. Take care.